Hi folks, welcome again to the Old Testament outline that we've been doing for the last few months. We've been looking at the Bible, the Old Testament, and following the story of Israel as God called his people. He chose Abraham and he chose Abraham's family specifically, and then to work through his descendants, the nation of Israel. And you see it's been unfolding. And as they entered the promised land, the nation of Israel entered the land. They took the land off the people who were living there, which is still a problem today, of course. And God gave them structures to put in place to help them. And we were looking at the law and the laws and the sacrifices and the priests and the priesthood and the tabernacle and the temple, to remind them of God's presence with them and to remind them of how to stay right with God. And so we were looking at key themes as we were working through, and we'll see that that men always sin, but that God is pointing back. He wants to bring them back, and he intensely desires relationship with men. And so with Israel, he wanted to show the world through Israel who he was, and yet they seem to get further away than anybody else sometimes. We were looking at the timeline, and we saw the early fathers, and then the selection of Abraham, the call of Abram, and then his family, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And then as Joseph brings the family into Egypt, they grow and grow and grow there, and then they are released from Egypt by God at the Exodus. And the Exodus leads to them spending a time wandering in the desert, and then a period of time where they enter the promised land and take it. And at that time, Moses, he led them in the wilderness, but God said he wouldn't enter the promised land. And so Joshua took over and led them into the promised land. And the tribes settled all over the area. We'll see that in a moment. And then during the time, the next 300 years, different people were raised up to keep people focused, to give them direction back to God. And they were called judges. So we'll look a little bit at them, but also about what was happening in Israel at the time and what God was showing the world at that time. So here's what we'll do. We'll start by looking at the promised land. In a funny, weird way, they came out of the Red Sea and came up this way, and then went right round in circles and ended up going round the River Jordan and coming back at it this way. So some of the tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, you can see Manasseh has a lot of land. It looks like they're the greedy ones. It looks like Judah's greedy as well, but actually some of the best land is the land that some of the other people chose. And Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh said, well, we don't want to cross the river. We've got our land. We're happy. We'll just stay here. And the deal was that wasn't fair on everybody else. They'd fought for them. So Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh would have to come and help clear the land for the rest of the Israelites. And so the other tribes could have their land, and then they would all go home and settle in their own space. And you can see that this is all the same piece of land that is being fought over at the moment. Some of this stuff, Reuben and Gad, you see, would be in Jordan now. Manasseh, the top half of the half tribe of Manasseh, so the top quarter of Manasseh, would be in Syria. And the Golan Heights is this area up here, just above, just to the east of the Eye of Naphtali. And there's been lots of fighting up there. You can see the Sea of Galilee is here, and then the River Jordan down to the Dead Sea. And this area there, we can see Golan there. So all of this area is the Golan Heights up in here. And there've been lots of fighting there between Israel and Syria. Some of this area, Asher and Naphtali, would now be Lebanon, and they have their fights as well with Israel. And then where Dan and Ephraim is, that's the west, that's the Gaza Strip. You see Gaza's down here. So from Dan down to Gaza is the Gaza Strip, that area there. And then the West Bank is the west bank of the River Jordan. So there's an area here that the Jews and the Palestinians are still fighting over. But at the time they took this section of land, and God said he'd given it to them, and they were to live there and to dwell there and to show the nations round them who God was and how it meant to live for God. It was a way of showing the world who he was, and he called Israel to do that. And so they took the land, and then they all went home. And as they went home, they did whatever they wanted, and they lived in their own land, in their own lives. You can see that even then there were nations around them and nations among them that were a problem. Edom is Esau's family, and they lived down there, and they had a problem with Israel. Moab as well are related, and they come through Lot, I think, and they wouldn't let Israel come through their land. The Ammonites were a problem for Israel all the time. The Aramites were a problem for Israel. And then down here in Gath, that's where the Philistines were. So even then there was all these cities and problems and issues. And so those were the cities: Ekron, Gath, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza. Those were the Philistine cities. And so you had all these nations from all around. And the 12 tribes of Israel were meant to live there for God. And as they did so, they would be a witness to those tribes around that God was good. And the tribes around them should be jealous of Israel and want to be part of that. So that the Israelites filled the land and subdued it. But there were times when things didn't quite go right. Or maybe they just needed a real leader. And God would call somebody to lead the nation of Israel. There was Moses, first of all. There was then Joshua. And after them, there was a number of others that God called specifically to help the nation of Israel. Often it was when there was a problem between them and the nations around them. The nations around them would rise up, would try and attack them, and would cause all sorts of problems. And not just the nations that we saw there, but further away, the Assyrians would come, which is where Syria is, which is Assyrians. You'd have later on, you'd have the folks coming all the way from Babylon, which would have been now Iraq, on the other side of Syria. They'd have nations all around them attacking them and causing them problems. And as they did that, God would raise up a leader to help set them free. These judges were chosen individually. Each one was an individual. And part of that meant that there was no legacy. Gideon's son wasn't Gideon and wasn't good at leading the people the way Gideon was, and so on, that God called individual leaders at an individual time to help the people. The individual leaders, some of the famous ones, would be Gideon, would be Barak, would be Deborah, would be Samson. They would be famous leaders that would come and do different things. By not having a king over Israel, the people could individually meet with God and serve God. They were allowed an individual relationship with God. They could choose for themselves how they were going to live and what they were going to do. And when God needed someone to be over the country, then he would raise up an individual leader. But sometimes even the tribes didn't like each other. At one point, they nearly wiped out the tribe of Benjamin because of something they did. And you can read about this in the book of Judges, that for hundreds of years, they lived without a king, and to the nations around them, that made them weak. But to God, that allowed them to have individual relationships. And when he raised up judges, some of them ruled with wisdom and led the people doing the right thing and guiding them. And others did massive exploits, took on great wars, defeated nations around them. And while one of those people with great exploits did great things, then for a while there would be peace. the nations around them would fear Gideon, and so they wouldn't attack. But there was no legacy. And that's both a good thing and a bad thing. The bad side of that, the fact that there's no legacy, is that the nations around them then would think, well, Gideon's died. We can go and do what we like now. These people are weak. They've no leader. They've got no king. But the good side of it was that they weren't relying on a man to represent God for them. And the family of a judge wasn't just assumed to be the next judge in line, the next one who would know what to do. The pressure wasn't there for them. The people could live by themselves. There was freedom in it. Freedom's such a good idea, but such a scary thing, because what they did and what we do most of the time is we take that freedom and we abuse it. We make a mess with it. We choose freely to do things that we know will only cause harm and problems. We choose freely to hurt each other. We choose freely to tell God that we will do our own thing. And that's what Israel did. And when they did that, God would allow the nations around them to mess them up, because that would draw them back to him. And then he would call somebody to free them. We see the same cycle that we talked about before when we were talking about the law, that God blessed Israel. But then they get complacent. They all do their own thing. They use their freedom to turn away from God. And so God punishes Israel. And when he punishes them, they cry out to God. And when they cry out to God, God blesses them. Another judge sets them free. Something amazing happens. And as you read the book of Judges, you'll see all the different stories, all the nations around them, all the people that they're fighting with, and you see God working through it all. In the middle of it all, there's still God. And there was ways that God had provided for them to connect with him. There were opportunities to gather. He says, you have to do this 4 times a year. You have to gather and have a festival. You have to have parties, because it's how you know that I'm a good God. You're reminded of the good things that I've given you, the harvests twice a year, the harvest offerings. I think harvest twice a year. Yeah, they had 2 harvests a year. They would gather and they would rejoice. They would have the Passover where they remember God's forgiveness and God setting them free from Egypt. And they would be drawn together and reminded of God's presence among them. But somehow in the middle, they would forget to do those things and they would get caught up in the cycle again. It's easy to judge them, but we do the same with our freedom. We do the same thing with our choices. God says, go and live as you like. In this country, you can do whatever you want. Freedom is one of your rules. Go and be who you want to be. Do what you want to do. And it sounds so good. But when we choose sin, when we choose to hurt one another, we just bring problems. We just bring enemies. We just hate each other. We just fall apart. And the problem is that what we do is with our freedom is we turn from God. Freedom is the ability to choose where you'll go. And you either turn to God or you turn from God. Now, the Israelites would go in a cycle, sometimes turning to God, sometimes turning from God, and the results would be opposites. When they turned to God, God would bless them. When they turned from God, God would punish them. But they still kept twisting and turning and doing their own thing. One of the key verses, it's so key, they repeat it twice. One of the key verses in the book of Judges, it's in Judges 17:6 and Judges 21:25. It says the same thing. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. I wonder if you stopped and think about that. I mean, there is still technically a monarch in our country. But don't we all just do what we want? The monarch certainly doesn't dictate to us what right and wrong is, what we should be doing, where we should be going. The Queen is very good at allowing the Parliament to lead in the decisions, allowing the people to choose for themselves. But with no one dictating to you, no one controlling you, you can do whatever you think is right in your own eyes. It's a battle for control. Do you take control and do what you want? Or do you take your freedom and give control to God? You see, when we think we're in control, like the Israelites, we've got the land, we're settled, we're calm, we've got everything. We suddenly realize that everything isn't in our control. Everything isn't the way we would make it. It doesn't work like that. When we think we've made all our choices, the results of those choices turn out to not be what we thought they were. And when you read that verse, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It sounds plausible. It sounds decent, doesn't it? It sounds good. Oh, okay. Everybody is free to do whatever they want. Isn't that great? And then you realize how terrifyingly terrible it is. What are some of the things that people think is right in their own eyes? What are some of the horrific injustices in the world that somebody thinks is okay? The abuse of people all over the world, slavery, the abuse of women, the problems in the world with child abuse, with just the overpowering and controlling of others, the stealing and embezzlement and fraud and all the things that people think, well, it's okay, I got away with it, that's fine. That's what people do when they're free to do whatever's right in their own eyes. See, freedom is just the ability to choose. And when they were in the land, they were free to choose to do whatever God wanted or to do whatever they wanted. And the nation of Israel, each one chose for themselves. And some of them chose very badly and made a complete mess of the nation. And when you see all that goes on, it's horrific. And it's just the same today. The thing is that freedom is a good thing. I'm not saying it's not. But freedom gives us the chance to choose. And freedom's good when we choose to do what God wants, when we choose to turn to God, when we choose to listen to him. See, Galatians 5 verse 1 says, it was for freedom that Christ set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. And you think, but I was never a slave. And yet the reality is, yes, you were. You were a slave to sin, and you're still a slave to sin. And in a lot of the ways you act and a lot of the things you do, you let it control you. You let what you feel you want control your life. In giving your life to Christ, truly giving your life to Christ, there's freedom for him to guide you, to be yoked to him and to see what he can do and to live a life that's everlasting and new. When there's no one to rule over you, sin rules over you. And the real freedom is to let Christ take the crown. Let Christ be your king. When Jesus then leads us, he'll set us free. And it's the sort of freedom that leads to life everlasting. I wonder, are we so concerned with having freedom, doing whatever I want, and whatever I want is okay, that we've missed what freedom really is? Is freedom something that leads to pain, to suffering, to abuse, to anger, to enemies? Is that freedom? I was just listening to the news briefly, and there was a man from Palestine being interviewed about the issues with Israel. And the interviewer said, in the interest of making peace, could you ever see there being a two-state solution? In the interest of your freedom, would you allow Israel to exist as well? And the man from Palestine avoided the question, repeated how Israel had invaded their land thousands of years ago, and again 100 years ago, and again used his freedom to say, I will not have Israel exist. I will not make room for them. I'm sure if I'd seen an interview with somebody from Israel, their response would be just as adamant that they were right, that they were free to do whatever they wanted. And because their army's better than the Palestinians, well, they have the power as well as the right. But the reality is, what they've done is ruin their land, make enemies of one another, bring hatred and death and suffering and loss and all of that into their world. Is that freedom? I'm going to give you a challenge today. As somebody who lives in Scotland, and one of the famous movies about one of the famous Scottish heroes is Braveheart. And in it, Mel Gibson shouts, they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom. I'm not even going to attempt accents. Mine's weird enough without trying another one. But I wonder, would you pause this week and think about freedom? And think about what you've done with yours. Has it led to hope and life and joy and friendship? In Christ, that's what freedom brings. It was for that kind of freedom that Christ set us free. Or has your freedom caused you to make enemies, caused you to be in debt, caused you to struggle, caused you to be angry because somebody else won't accept who you are, what you've done? Let's understand what freedom really is. And let's make a choice today. Again, what will you do with your freedom? See, Galatians 5 verse 1 says, when you don't give your freedom to Christ and let him be in control, your attempts at control cause you to be a slave to the world, a slave to the sin of the world and the sin in your life, and a slave to the devil who causes the power of the air, who causes chaos and trouble and makes things worse all the time. What will you do with your freedom?